March 28, 1879, marked the last public execution in the state of Tennessee, or at least the last public execution by the Department of Justice anyway. The event in Nashville was attended by, according to reports, upwards of 10,000 people. Some have it listed as 12,000 people. Some of those in attendance were children that had been removed from school by their mothers, just to watch the show. During the execution, a passing train spooked a group of horses, causing a wave of excitement to move through that portion of the crowd. One of the spectators, caught up in the moment, fired off his gun, for whatever reason, and the bullet struck a woman in the leg. The gunshot also caused the horses to stampede. No one else was seriously hurt, but this followed not long after a similar event at an execution in Memphis, Tennessee, where a carriage had overturned, killing someone in the crowd. It had become obvious to Tennessee officials that public executions had become too rowdy and dangerous, thus marking the hanging of Knox Martin as the last public execution in Tennessee history. But let's not gloss over the fact that there were more than 10,000 people in attendance that day. What drew that amount of people to this particular execution? Knox Martin had been charged with double homicide. As bad as that is, I'm sure there were worse crimes in those days. Maybe, just maybe, the turnout for this particular execution was the fact that Knox Martin had agreed to turn his body over to science, and the doctor's own site had announced that immediately following the execution, they would attempt to bring Knox Martin back from the dead. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture, some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. On the morning of January 15th, 1879, the bodies of John and Elizabeth Wittenmeyer were discovered in their farmhouse about 12 miles west of Nashville, Tennessee, still in their bed and covered in blood. Their faces were nearly unrecognizable from blunt force trauma, and the couple's 18-month-old son, Charles, was crying, lying on his mother's chest, attempting to nurse. Their 3-year-old son, Fred, was still asleep at the foot of the bed. A third child, 5-year-old daughter, Teresa, had spent the night with grandparents. According to newspaper reports in the Tennessean, John Wittenmeyer had received a heavy blow by what was speculated to have been an axe, crushing the right side of his face. Elizabeth Wittenmeyer had a nearly identical wound to the left side of her face, as well as a broken neck, broken left arm, and a shattered jaw. None of the children were harmed, and it appeared they had slept through the attack. The investigation revealed that John's wallet had been gone through and emptied. There were several objects found within the home that could have been the murder weapon, but all were found with no blood on them. The speculation now was that the attacker must have taken the weapon with him. A wash basin within the home was filled with bloody water, implying that the murderer had cleaned himself up. There was also 2 open jars of preserves on the table, indicating that the attacker had stayed for a while, fixing himself something to eat before leaving. It wasn't long before authorities had a lead. A man named George Berry went to the police and told them that a man by the name of Knox Martin had told him that he committed the crime. According to Berry, he and Martin both had previously worked for John Wittenmeyer. Berry stated that both he and Martin had had an argument with Wittenmeyer weeks earlier, saying that they had worked 1 day more than Wittenmeyer had paid them for. Berry said that Wittenmeyer did end up paying the 2 men for the additional day, but insisted that his records were correct and that the 2 men were attempting to scam him. Because of that, Wittenmeyer terminated their employment, and according to Berry, the 2 men just left. Berry's claim was that Knox Martin came to him after the murders and admitted to the crime. Berry told authorities that his involvement in the previous argument was why he immediately came to them. He didn't want to be a suspect in anyone else's eyes. A nearby ferryman also reported having seen Knox Martin, first in the afternoon before, requesting a ride across the Cumberland River. Martin had come to him again early the next morning, needing a crossing of the river again. According to the ferryman, that morning's river crossing found Knox Martin a lot less talkative than the day before. He reported Knox as being more hesitant and anxious, as well as wearing much nicer clothes than the day before, clothing that matched the description of those that belonged to John Wittenmeyer. With information from George Berry and the ferryman, authorities now knew that Knox Martin was a 20-year-old former slave from Jackson County, Alabama, and that after the Civil War, he and some family had come to the Nashville area to look for work on the railroad. With the help of George Berry, Knox Martin was found at Knox's brother's house and arrested at gunpoint after attempting to run from the police. Now in custody, Knox Martin confessed to the crime. According to police records, these are his words. "I came here from Alabama. I've been here only a few months. I went to work for Mr. Wittenmeyer on the 15th of November and left him Christmas week. I went to the house for the purpose of killing Wittenmeyer, but did not intend to hurt his wife. Aunt Mary, a witch living in the neighborhood, told me that he intended to kill me the first time I put foot on his ground, and my fear that he would kill me is the reason I wanted to kill him. I had nothing against the woman and hit her by accident. The weapon I used was a wagon spoke. I killed them around 8 o'clock Tuesday night. When I went into the house, Wittenmeyer raised up in bed, and I went toward him and hit him with only 1 lick, killing him. The spoke was so long that the end of it hit Mrs. Wittenmeyer in the face, and fearing that she would tell, I killed her. I put the spoke in the fire and burned it up. The children did not wake up. The little one was sleeping by the side of its mother, and the big one at the foot of the bed. I then pulled a quilt over them and covered them up. I looked in the drawer and took 50 cents out of the pocketbook. I went out into the yard to a pile of hay and lay down on it and slept until daylight when I came to town. I took from the house Wittenmeyer's old hat, overcoat, and a pair of black pants. Nobody helped me to commit these murders. I did not tell anybody about it except George Berry. The reason I told him was that he told me a long piece was in the American and that I was a suspect, and asked me if I did. I told him all about it. By the time the case made it to trial, Knox Martin had changed his story though, claiming that both he and George Berry committed the crime. No evidence of this was ever found though, and no charges were ever brought against George Berry. On February 21st, 1879, Knox Martin was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was held in jail for a month, and his lawyers offered to prepare an appeal to the Supreme Court, but Knox Martin told them not to. He told them he was ready for the end, preferring to die rather than suffer remorse in jail. Martin admitted to having nightmares of the Whitmires every night since the murders, and it appeared that Knox Martin felt genuine guilt and remorse for what he had done. During his wait in jail, Knox Martin refused most visitors, but not all. He did meet with a Catholic group, Sisters of Charity, regularly. It's reported that they had a large impact on Martin's final days, and the night before his execution, Knox Martin was baptized into the Catholic faith. The jailers reported that Knox Martin was always calm and cooperative, accepting of his fate, as well as his newfound faith. They said the only time he showed any sadness was when his brother Peter came to tell him goodbye. Catholic priest Father Veal, who had become Martin's spiritual advisor, reported the same demeanor of Knox Martin. The only change was the day of the execution, but even then, the only change was Martin appeared restless. After prayers with Father Veal, Knox Martin was loaded into a wagon and ushered to the nearby gallows. The procession from the jail to the gallows followed streets packed with spectators of all ages and races, but through it all, Knox Martin remained calm, even smoking a cigar for part of the ride. Once on site, there was a series of prayers again with Father Veal. Then Knox Martin was led onto the scaffolding of the gallows. At 1:33 in the afternoon, on March 28, 1879, the trap door of the gallows was opened, and Knox Martin became the last public execution in the state of Tennessee. Medical reports say that the body only made 2 convulsions, then was still. After hanging for 10 minutes, attending doctors on site pronounced Knox Martin dead and called for the sheriff to cut the man down. But the sheriff refused, stating that the law called for at least 15 minutes. The sheriff waited until 1:48 p.m. before giving the orders to cut the man down. Although public executions were common in those days and known to draw a crowd, this one was different. And now that the execution was over, this was what the crowd had come for. You see, just days earlier, Knox Martin had agreed to give his body over to physicians at Vanderbilt for experimentation. 2 doctors, Dr. Summers and Dr. Steger, took possession of the body and immediately realigned the dislocated bones in Knox Martin's neck before loading the body into a coffin and taking it to a small shed on a nearby hill, the large crowd following close behind them. Both Dr. Summers and Dr. Steger were interested in a medical theory called galvanism, the theory that electricity was responsible for muscle contraction and movement. This 18th century discovery laid the groundwork for modern electrotherapy, but in a more metaphysical school of thought, it was believed that electricity could be used to bring the dead back to life. Are you familiar with the story of Frankenstein? Well, there you go. Although it's viewed as science fiction today, in those days, it was based on current medical practices, and Drs. Summer and Steger were eager to try it out for themselves. In the shed, the body of Knox Martin was stripped of his clothes, and assistants began massaging the muscles in his arms and legs, while the doctors affixed electrodes at the base of the body's head and on the chest at the heart. The other ends of the electrode ran back to a bank of crude batteries. The assistants then stepped back as the doctors readied to switch on the power. When they did, the arms and legs of Knox Martin began to spasm. Then, his head lifted up, his eyes flying open. Witnesses said that the body of Knox Martin then began to groan, and sweat covered the man instantly. It began to seem that the doctors from Vanderbilt had achieved the impossible. But as the powers in the batteries began to drain, any signs of life faded away from the body. Knox Martin was then pronounced dead, for the second time. When the crowd finally began to break apart and go back to their lives, the body of Knox Martin was put back into a wagon and transported to the medical college. What further experiments were conducted is not known. The doctors and staff stayed tight-lipped about anything else that was done. Eventually, Knox Martin was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in nearby Mount Olivet Cemetery. Or that's how the official story goes anyway. Even though the events were still fresh on the mind of the citizens of Nashville and curiosity was still very high, the burial was done in secret. There was no announcement, and there aren't any records or reports of anyone being in attendance or seeing the burial. As far as the citizens knew, the burial hadn't even happened. There were many of those in attendance the day of the hanging that swore the body of Knox Martin had actually been revived. And as the word spread, the stories of the South Nashville Frankenstein was born. Aside from the story of Knox Martin being buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery, others believed he had been revived and eventually let go, saying that Knox Martin had then moved to Kansas to start life over. Later reports would crop up, though, that would imply that both these stories were not true. On April the 6th, a week after the execution and experiment, the Tennessean newspaper published a quote from a letter received from a farmer in Madison County, Alabama, strangely near Jackson County, the home county of Knox Martin. Yesterday, a man passed through here, giving his name as Knox Martin, and then said he was hung in Nashville Friday and was afterwards brought back to life by the doctors. He was on his way to Jackson County, where he used to live. Is this Knox Martin alive or dead? Please write and let me know. There is some excitement here about him. I am not satisfied, so I ask you to write. Then, 2 days later, on April the 8th, the Nashville Savings Bank received a package postmarked from Montgomery, Alabama. The only thing inside the package was a single portrait, a portrait of Knox Martin, holding a rope. After that, any reports or connections to Knox Martin disappeared. That is, until 6 years later. A man named J.P. Manning was arrested on charges of larceny in April 1885. As the case against him was being built, it was revealed that a known alias of Manning was none other than Knox Martin. Manning claimed knowledge of the events of the Wittenmeyer murders, as well as claimed that he had, quote, survived an execution for those crimes. J.P. Manning was ultimately charged, did his time, and was released, never to be heard from again. I could find no further record on J.P. Manning after that, but seeing as this took place in 1885, it's safe to say that J.P. Manning is no longer living. Probably. But if his story is to be believed, that would mark the third time that Knox Martin was pronounced dead. Well, the third time that we all know about, anyway.